I want you to picture something for a second. Think about the last time you were, just falling headfirst into a new romantic relationship.
Oh, yeah, that absolute whirlwind phase.
Exactly. Or even just harboring a really intense, all-consuming crush on someone. You know the exact physical sensations I'm talking about? You get that fluttery, anxious feeling right in the center of your chest.
Right.
You find yourself hanging on their every single text message, analyzing the punctuation, daydreaming about, like, mundane errands you could run together.
Going to the grocery store suddenly feels like an adventure.
Yeah, exactly. And in that very specific, very intoxicating moment, there is this profound, unshakable assumption that you are acting entirely of your own free will.
You really do. You assume that your unique individual heart is functioning as this perfectly calibrated compass.
Right. And it's pointing you toward this one specific person because of some, I don't know, ineffable personal chemistry. It feels like the most private, isolated, intimate experience in the world.
Like it's just you, them, and this invisible tether between you.
Totally. It feels completely internal.
It does. I mean, the phenomenon of infatuation, it creates this sort of psychological tunnel vision where the entire outside world just fades into the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
And it genuinely feels as though the entire universe has just shrunk down to the pure, unadulterated dynamic between two individuals acting purely on instinct.
But the reality is actually far more crowded than that. Because as we are going to explore today in this deep dive, you are absolutely not alone in that relationship.
Not even close.
Right. When you jump into bed with someone, or when you swipe right on a specific face on a dating app, or when you sit back and imagine what your future wedding ought to look like, you are actually sitting in the company of thousands of societal voices.
Yeah, it's a really crowded room.
It is. And these voices have been whispering in your ear since childhood, dictating and micromanaging exactly how you are supposed to love,
Yeah.
the specific physical traits you're supposed to desire, and like what the very definition of a successful relationship even is.
It is a totally jarring realization for most people.
Absolutely.
To confront the idea that their private desires are not entirely their own, it's intense, but it is deeply transformative once you understand the mechanics behind it.
So today, we are unpacking a fascinating academic text. It's a chapter titled Love is Political: How Power and Bias Influence Our Intimate Lives.
And their central thesis really just cuts straight to the core of this illusion. Love, they argue, does not exist in a sociopolitical vacuum.
Right. And before we go a single step further, I want to clarify a piece of terminology for you, the listener, because it is basically the lens through which we'll be examining everything today.
This is an important distinction to make early on.
Definitely. When we say love is political, we are not talking about governments. We're not talking about elections or legislation or, who you voted for in the last midterms.
Right. We aren't picturing politicians arguing over a candlelit dinner.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
exactly. To give this the proper context, the source text borrows this broader definition of politics from early feminist sociology.
Specifically, the idea that politics simply refers to power dynamics.
Okay.
It refers to the ways in which people jockey for status within groups, the way social hierarchies are established and maintained, and the ways in which broad societal inequalities inevitably seep into our most intimate private interactions.
So it's about the invisible currents of power that run through human connection. Who is granted influence, whose traits are valued, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Now, because the authors of this source are navigating incredibly charged territory, I mean, they're unpacking systemic race issues, gender dynamics, human sexuality, the history of marriage, our goal today isn't to tell you what is right or wrong.
No, not at all.
We are acting purely as your guides. We want to map out exactly how these researchers view the invisible architecture of our private lives, regardless of where you might personally fall on the political spectrum.
Right. We're just here to examine their arguments, look closely at the empirical evidence they present, and really help you understand the framework they've built.
Exactly. It's a comprehensive look at how society manages our love lives from start to finish. So let's just dive right in. Let's start at the very beginning of the timeline of love.
The initial spark.
The spark. Because before we can even begin to analyze a long-term partnership, we have to look at attraction. We have to ask the fundamental question. Why are we attracted to the specific people we are attracted to?
Well, traditional psychology has spent decades trying to map that out. And historically, the field usually roots attraction in this broad concept called social reinforcement.
Okay, social reinforcement. What does that actually look like in practice?
Stripped down to its essence, it suggests that human beings are naturally drawn to individuals who provide them with positive, rewarding experiences. We like relationships that make us feel good, secure, or validated.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And the text breaks down several classic psychological concepts here. One of the foundational pillars is the mere exposure effect.
Oh, right. Let's unpack the mechanics of that one. The mere exposure effect essentially means that familiarity breeds affection, right?
In a sense, yes, but the neurological underpinning is what makes it so powerful. When we encounter a novel stimulus, a new face, a new environment, our brain naturally uses a bit of extra cognitive energy to process it.
Like it's on high alert.
Exactly. Our amygdala might even flag it with a tiny bit of wariness because it's unknown. But the second, third, or 50th time we see that same face, say at the office water cooler or the local coffee shop, our brain experiences something called cognitive fluency.
Cognitive fluency, meaning it gets easier to process.
Yes. It becomes incredibly easy for our neural pathways to process that person's features. And the brain loves efficiency. So this ease of processing is interpreted internally as a positive, comforting sensation.
Oh, wow. So we then take that internal feeling of cognitive comfort and just, mislabel it as romantic attraction.
Precisely. We interpret that ease as affection toward the person.
That makes total sense when you consider how many people end up dating their coworkers or their classmates. It isn't necessarily destiny, it's just your brain rewarding you for visual repetition.
Right. It's just proximity and repetition.
So what else does traditional psychology point to, besides just being around someone a lot?
Another major pillar is the matching hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes a sort of subconscious social calculus.
Subconscious social calculus. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, it suggests that individuals naturally tend to seek out and partner up with people who closely match them in terms of perceived social attributes. This could be physical attractiveness, sure, but it also includes socioeconomic wealth, educational background, or general social status.
So we basically implicitly calculate our own value in the dating marketplace and seek out a partner with a comparable score.
Exactly. It minimizes the risk of rejection while maximizing the social reward.
Interesting.
And closely related to that is the similarity attraction effect. This principle simply notes that we are overwhelmingly drawn to people who share our beliefs, our values, and our backgrounds.
Because having our own worldview reflected back at us by a partner provides immense psychological validation.
You got it. It feels good to have someone agree with you.
Okay, I hear all of those foundational theories. But looking at that, I have to push back a little bit on behalf of the listener here.
Go for it.
If attraction is largely dictated by who we are repeatedly exposed to or who shares our similar socioeconomic background, well, who is determining the exposure in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. And beyond that, what about the biological argument? We are constantly bombarded with the idea that attraction is just hardwired into our DNA by evolutionary psychology.
The whole caveman instincts narrative.
Exactly. We hear about objective, universal standards of beauty all the time. Things like perfect facial symmetry indicating genetic health, or specific waist-to-hip ratios that supposedly bypass our logical brains and signal fertility directly.
Right.
Isn't having a type ultimately just genetics driving the vehicle?
So that is the exact tension the authors highlight in this text.
Yeah.
And they actively dismantled that jump to universality.
They don't buy the biological argument.
Not as the primary driver, no. The idea that there are objective, innate, biologically anchored standards of beauty is incredibly comforting to people.
Because if our desires are purely evolutionary, then they are entirely natural, morally neutral, and completely unquestionable.
Exactly. We don't have to take responsibility for them if it's just our DNA. However, the authors argue that this is a vast oversimplification. The empirical evidence they present tells a very different story about the power of environment over biology.
What kind of evidence?
They point to a pivotal, large-scale study on twins. The researchers wanted to separate genetic influence from environmental influence when it comes to aesthetic preferences.
Studying twins is usually the gold standard for isolating genetics. So what did they find regarding who we find beautiful?
The findings were profound. They discovered that while genetics might play a tiny baseline role, an individual's unique cultural and environmental experiences are actually far stronger determinants of their aesthetic preferences.
Wait, really? So the environment essentially overpowers the biological hardwiring?
Yes. Yeah. Especially when it comes to faces. To further illustrate how cultural context rewrites our biological drives, the text references compelling research on different ethnic groups living within the exact same broader society.
And what did that show?
They found that these distinct groups reported entirely different, deeply ingrained preferences for female body types.
And if attraction were purely a universal evolutionary drive, that shouldn't happen.
Right.
If we were all just operating on a primal, universal hominid blueprint for fertility and health, you would expect every single person, regardless of their cultural subgroup, to gravitate toward the exact same physical dimensions.
Precisely the author's point. What often happens is a misdiagnosis of causality. Evolutionary psychologists will sometimes observe a specific physical trait that is highly desirable within one specific modern sociocultural context.
Like a certain body mass index or skin tone?
Exactly. And they will mistakenly distill that culturally constructed preference into a universal human mate preference, basically inventing a post hoc biological justification for it.
That's wild. So they see a cultural trend and just assume it's human nature.
Yeah. The text argues that the sociopolitical institutions that structure our society are what actually determine the mere exposure we talked about earlier.
Oh, I see.
Think about residential redlining, economic segregation, or the types of demographics that have historical access to certain universities or elite social spaces.
Those institutions dictate who you interact with on a daily basis. They dictate who you achieve that cognitive fluency with.
Yes, and crucially, they dictate whose physical traits are culturally defined as valuable.
Okay, if society is establishing the menu of who is valuable, let's look at how that plays out in modern dating. Because the authors bring up a brilliant, though pretty uncomfortable, example regarding dating apps.
This is where it gets very real for a lot of people.
Yeah. Imagine you are swiping through profiles. You see someone's bio that says must love dogs or looking for someone who loves hiking. And then a few swipes later, you see a bio that explicitly states no Asians, no Black people. The text highlights that society often tries to treat all of these statements as equal personal quirks. But one of these things is absolutely not like the other.
No, it forces a critical sociological question. When an individual expresses an absolute sweeping prohibition against entire demographics of human beings based purely on racial or physical characteristics, can we really brush that off as a harmless, biological personal preference?
Or are we looking at the localized manifestation of a massive systemic political structure?
And the authors conclude it is unequivocally systemic.
They argue that our most intimate desires are tethered to a broader political system that actively ranks human beings.
Right. This system ranks people by skin color, by body size, by physical ability, and by age. And these rankings are not arbitrary or random.
They were constructed historically to maintain a social order, right? Where the physical characteristics of the dominant, powerful group in society are inherently valued over the physical characteristics of marginalized groups.
The codification of this dominance into our daily lives is stark. The text draws on research regarding the environmental injustice of beauty standards. They examine the intense, persistent societal pressure placed on women of color to engage in physically altering, sometimes dangerous practices.
Like skin bleaching or the chemical straightening of natural hair.
Exactly. These multi-billion-dollar industries do not exist in a vacuum. They exist because the dominant culture has established a potent, highly rewarded preference for European white features.
And the critical mechanism here is that those macro-cultural preferences do not just stay in the ether. They inevitably trickle down and take root in the individual subconscious psyches of the people living within that culture.
They become our unquestioned personal types.
Think about your own type for a second, listener. Think about the specific physical traits that instantly turn your head when you walk into a crowded room.
It is a deeply unsettling cognitive exercise.
It really is. To sit back and consider that someone else, a societal structure of power, might have trained you to desire those specific traits. It is comparable to realizing that a third-party programmer has been quietly writing the code for your personal emotional operating system your entire life.
And you just assumed you were generating the software yourself.
Right.
It is a terrifying loss of perceived autonomy. And the authors are very empathetic to the fact that strong, sometimes angry resistance is the common knee-jerk reaction to this framework.
Well, of course. Nobody wants to be told their desires aren't their own.
We possess a deep-seated psychological need to believe that our intimate attractions are sacred. We want to believe they are organic, innate drives originating from deep within our souls, completely insulated from external sociological critique.
The text provides a really striking, empathetic example of this psychological friction. They ask us to imagine a white woman who prides herself deeply on her progressive, anti-racist values.
Right. She donates to the right causes. She educates herself on systemic inequality. She genuinely and fiercely believes in social justice.
But for this hypothetical woman, it might be profoundly upsetting, even identity-shattering, to realize that her consistent, exclusive romantic desire for white partners isn't just a harmless, biologically predetermined quirk.
To accept the author's premise is to accept that her desire was absorbed from a dominant culture that historically devalued people of color.
To acknowledge that is to admit that even our most private, supposedly pure desires have been politically compromised by the world we live in.
Confronting that requires a level of rigorous self-interrogation that is, frankly, exhausting, which is why most people understandably deploy defensive cognitive mechanisms to avoid it.
It is much easier to just say the heart wants what it wants and leave it at that.
Much easier. But the scientific consensus the authors point to shows that individual-level phenomena, our attitudes, our implicit biases, and yes, even our physiological arousal and sexual imprinting are highly malleable.
They are sculpted by environmental factors.
Exactly. If we refuse to interrogate the origins of our desires, we are passively allowing historical societal hierarchies to continue operating invisibly in our daily lives.
So, if society is so successful at controlling the physical traits we find attractive, it makes you wonder what happens when we actually find that person. Does society back off once the match is made, or does it start dictating the relationship itself?
Oh, it definitely doesn't back off.
Not even a little. According to the text, society immediately hands us a heavy, rigid script for what that love is supposed to look like. Which brings us to the concept of the soulmate trap and the politics of true love.
The quest for the one is perhaps the most pervasive psychological narrative in modern Western culture.
It is absolutely everywhere. The text mentions a recent poll showing that a staggering 2/3 of American adults fundamentally believe in the existence of soulmates.
And when you look at the conditioning, you understand why. We are indoctrinated into this framework from infancy.
Yeah, we are raised on fairy tales, the specific narratives of Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, which promise that destiny will deliver a single, flawless Prince Charming to solve our lives.
As we age, the medium changes, but the message doesn't. It just morphs into Hollywood romantic comedies, endless romance novels, and now complex dating app algorithms.
Oh, the algorithms. They explicitly market themselves as mathematical tools to locate your perfect, singular match out of billions of humans.
It is a massive cultural apparatus dedicated to a single narrative. Interestingly, the authors note, citing comprehensive sociological research, that there is robust evidence indicating those proprietary matching algorithms do not actually possess the predictive power they claim to have.
Really?
Yeah, they cannot mathematically guarantee long-term compatibility any better than standard psychological baselines.
Yet the cultural preoccupation with finding this algorithmic or destined soulmate remains completely undiminished.
Exactly. And the authors argue that this obsession isn't merely a byproduct of harmless romanticism. It is actually the foundation of a deeply entrenched, politically motivated orientation that elevates monogamy as the singular, unquestionable ideal for human relationships.
Now, that sounds like a massive leap. How is the concept of a soulmate a political mandate for monogamy?
We have to look at the historical timeline of how marriage has been regulated and controlled. Because marriage is the ultimate societal and governmental stamp of approval for romantic love.
Right.
The government has historically wielded immense power in dictating whose love is legally recognized, protected, and financially rewarded. The authors provide a timeline that is deeply sobering.
Like the fact that in the United States, interracial marriage love across culturally constructed racial boundaries was actually criminalized in many states until the Supreme Court intervened in the late 1960s.
Yes, and same-sex marriage was largely illegal and socially ostracized until 2015. And the text rightly notes that same-sex couples still navigate a precarious landscape of lingering stigma today.
And the text points out that even today, right now, the legal code strictly prohibits marriage between more than two consenting adults.
Exactly.
This blanket prohibition completely invalidates individuals who practice consensually non-monogamous or CNM relationships.
Precisely. By heavily regulating the institution of marriage in this way, the state and society send a very clear, potent political message. Only certain people, living in a very specific, dyadic, strictly monogamous configuration, are qualified to receive the societal respect, the structural benefits, and the governmental validation of true love.
So anyone who fails to conform to that strict two-person script just becomes a marginalized victim of structural inequality.
That's the argument.
I can easily imagine a listener thinking, oh, okay, I understand the legal argument, but on an individual level, what is the actual harm? Believing in a soulmate seems like a beautiful, optimistic way to approach life. Why does it matter if society promotes the idea of a perfect match?
It matters because of the immense, often crushing psychological pressure it creates. Ironically, the pursuit of the perfect soulmate often sabotages the very relationships it is supposed to protect.
How so?
The text details a brilliant, revealing experiment that perfectly illustrates the cognitive danger of this framework. Researchers brought participants into a lab and subtly primed them with one of two different cognitive frameworks for thinking about romantic love.
Break down the methodology of that study, because the way they tested this was fascinating.
The first group was primed with what the researchers called the love as unity framework. This is the classic soulmate idea, the concept that you and your partner are two halves of a whole, a perfect predestined match made for each other.
Okay.
They used linguistic cues and imagery to activate this concept in the participants' minds. The second group was primed with the love as journey framework.
Which is the idea that a relationship is a long path you walk together, something that requires constant navigation, adaptation, and mutual effort.
Exactly. So one group is essentially operating on the software of we're destined by the cosmos. And the other group is running on we're a team working through the wilderness.
Got it.
After establishing those subconscious primes, the researchers asked all the participants to reflect on specific conflicts, arguments, or friction points within their current real-life relationships.
And what happened?
The psychological fallout was striking. The individuals who had been primed with the soulmate unity framework reported significantly lower relationship satisfaction after recalling conflicts compared to the group primed with the journey framework.
Looking at that study, it almost seems like they expose a psychological trap.
That's exactly what it is.
If I'm primed to believe in a perfect soulmate destiny, the first time my partner forgets to take out the trash or we argue about finances, I'm not just annoyed. I'm having an existential crisis about the fabric of our universe. Is that the cognitive dissonance the researchers were seeing?
That is exactly the mechanism at play. If your foundational belief is that your partner is your flawless, destined soulmate, then the sudden, inevitable appearance of conflict feels like a catastrophic failure of the entire premise of the relationship.
Cognitive dissonance must be overwhelming. You start thinking, if we are arguing about the dishes, maybe the universe made a mistake.
Right, maybe they aren't the one after all, and I need to leave to find my true match. The authors suggest that this culturally mandated framework causes people to prematurely discard perfectly good, potentially deeply rewarding relationships simply because they have internalized a fabricated, politically motivated ideal that true love is supposed to be utterly conflict-free.
And that pressure is magnified exponentially when we look at the sheer volume of expectations we are currently placing on that one destined partner.
Oh, absolutely.
The text dives into sociological research regarding the evolution of modern marriage. Historically, marriage was an agrarian or economic survival arrangement. You partnered up to ensure you had enough labor to run a farm or merge assets.
Over time, particularly during the Industrial Revolution, it shifted toward a model based on companionship and love. But we have now entered what sociologists call the self-expressive era of marriage.
In this modern era, the expectations have skyrocketed to an unsustainable peak. We now rely on a single individual to fulfill an impossibly broad spectrum of human needs.
Yes. Historically, a human being had an entire village or a massive extended family to meet their various needs. Now we have one person.
We demand that they be our equal financial partner, our intellectual peer, our empathetic best friend, our co-parent, our amateur therapist, our spiritual guru, and our relentlessly passionate lover.
It's exhausting just listing it all.
It is the equivalent of buying a single Swiss Army knife and demanding that it not only open your bottle of wine, but also build you a 4-bedroom house and file your taxes.
That's a great analogy.
And when the tiny little saw blade inevitably fails to cut down a redwood tree, we throw the entire knife away in disgust, believing it's broken. It is a mathematically absurd amount of pressure to place on the shoulders of one flawed human being.
And the psychological weight of that expectation is immense. When we consolidate our entire social support network into a single dyad, we create a structure that is inherently fragile. Society tells us that if this one person fails to flawlessly execute every single one of those roles, our relationship is deficient.
Which naturally leads to the author's defense of alternative relationship models. Because society absolutely demands that we abstract everything from one person, it looks incredibly harshly upon anyone who chooses to disperse those heavy needs among multiple consenting partners.
Yes. The text spends time defending the validity of consensually non-monogamous or CNM relationships against this societal judgment.
The general public harbors a deeply ingrained perception that polyamory or open relationships must be inherently chaotic and miserable, right?
The cultural assumption is that these relationships are plagued by rampant jealousy, low trust, instability, and low overall satisfaction. But the authors argue that this perception is not grounded in reality. It is a manifestation of the political mandate that monogamy must remain supreme.
Right, because if society admits that C&M couples are happy, it threatens the entire soulmate narrative we just discussed. So what does the actual data say?
The empirical data fundamentally contradicts the societal narrative. The authors point to extensive research in this area, which demonstrates that individuals engaged in C&M relationships flourish just as much as those in monogamous configurations.
Really, just as much.
Across various metrics, they experience comparable and sometimes higher levels of trust, communication, and relationship satisfaction. The public's negative perception is just a tool of social control, used to marginalize those who step outside the political boundaries of accepted love.
So we've unraveled the spark of attraction, and we've exposed the heavy burden of the soulmate narrative. This transitions us perfectly into the next phase of the relationship life cycle.
Right, the maintenance phase.
Because if finding a soulmate is culturally set up as a magical fairy tale, the text argues that keeping them is set up as an agonizing, never-ending shift at the factory. Why do we feel this immense, crushing societal pressure to keep relationships alive even long after the love has died?
It begins with our deep cultural obsession with longevity as the ultimate and oft-only metric of a successful romantic relationship.
The text cites a poll which found that an astonishing 86% of people believe that once they marry, they will remain with that specific person until the literal day they die.
There is an unquestioned assumption woven into our social fabric that a lifelong, unbroken partnership is the highest possible achievement, the ultimate provider of stability, personal growth, and security.
But the authors ask a very provocative, almost taboo question. Why do human beings feel compelled to stubbornly persist at relationships even after they are fundamentally unhappy and have fallen completely out of love?
And to answer that, they bring the theories of sociologist Max Weber right into the bedroom.
Okay, Weber in the bedroom. How does that work?
It is a brilliant application of sociological theory to intimate life. Max Weber famously wrote about the Protestant work ethic, or PWE, in the early 20th century.
Right.
The core driving tenet of the Protestant work ethic is that hard work, self-discipline, and relentless persistence are inherent moral virtues that will inevitably be rewarded by success or salvation.
Typically, we apply Weber's theories to capitalism, career advancement, and economic structures.
Yes. However, the authors argue that modern society has mapped this exact same puritanical ethic directly onto our romantic lives.
So what does this all mean? The societal script essentially frames a marriage or a long-term relationship as a job.
Exactly. And the promise is that if you just put your head down, suffer through the hard parts, and relentlessly do the work, you will eventually be rewarded with the payoff of a happy lifelong marriage.
The relationship becomes a labor site.
Yes. And the insidious dark side of the Protestant work ethic of love is how it frames the end of a relationship.
If hard work guarantees success, then a failed relationship is viewed not as a natural emotional evolution, but as a profound personal and moral failure of effort.
Right. Admitting that you are no longer in love or that you simply want to leave is interpreted by society as giving up. The cultural translation is that you were lazy, you lacked grit, you weren't willing to put in the requisite elbow grease to save the marriage.
Furthermore, because individuals have invested so much emotional and temporal labor into the relationship over years or decades, they fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy.
To walk away would be to admit that all those years of grueling effort were fundamentally wasted.
So if a marriage collapses, society's default reaction is to treat the two individuals as morally lazy, rather than accepting that maybe two human beings simply grew in different directions over 20 years.
That is the exact stigma the authors are targeting. The critical flaw in applying the Protestant work ethic to love is that it's a hyper-individualistic framework.
It pins the entire burden of success or failure solely on the shoulders of the two individuals inside the dyad.
And in doing so, it conveniently, entirely ignores the massive structural external forces that are constantly battering relationships from the outside.
The text provides some incredibly stark, sobering examples of this. They cite research highlighting the real, tangible forces that destroy relationships, forces that have absolutely nothing to do with the purity of your soulmate connection or how much elbow grease you put into couples therapy.
Exactly.
For instance, they point to research which draws a direct, devastating link between severe financial strain and relationship dissatisfaction.
Okay.
When you are terrified about eviction or feeding your kids, the emotional bandwidth required to nurture a romantic connection completely evaporates.
And it goes deeper than economics.
Yeah.
Other data demonstrates how systemic racial and ethnic discrimination acts as a massive, chronic stressor on marriages for people of color.
The physiological wear and tear on the body and mind caused by navigating a racist society infiltrates the home, right?
Yes, it strains the emotional reserves of the couple. Additionally, sociological data highlights stark disparities in marriage longevity, based simply on education levels, which often correlate with access to resources, healthcare, and stable employment.
When you look at the reality of that data, it becomes clear that the world is often actively, structurally working against people's ability to maintain their love. Poverty, systemic racism, lack of health care, these exert immense, sometimes fatal pressure on a relationship.
Yet society comfortably ignores all of those macro factors, points a finger at the exhausted individuals, and says, your marriage failed because you just didn't try hard enough.
The human cost of that specific societal judgment is profound and heartbreaking. The authors discuss a poignant study involving in-depth interviews with divorced women who were only in their 20s and 30s.
The overriding, inescapable theme in those interviews was the crushing weight of societal stigma.
These women felt like utter, irredeemable failures because they couldn't make their marriages last a lifetime. Some of them felt such intense shame that they actively hid their divorces from friends and colleagues, pretending to still be married.
They were carrying the unbearable, personalized weight of failing the Protestant work ethic of romance.
I want to direct this thought to the listener for a second. Think about the vocabulary we use when we talk about breakups. We almost exclusively use the phrase failed marriage or a failed relationship.
It's so ingrained in our language.
But what if a lifelong timeline isn't the only valid metric for a beautiful, meaningful connection? What if we could completely rewrite that narrative?
That would change everything.
Imagine if we could celebrate a healthy, mutually respectful breakup as a positive, necessary life transition. What if we recognize that falling out of love is a perfectly natural human experience, and that acknowledging an ending allows both people to go on and lead incredibly fulfilling lives separately?
Why do we force ourselves and each other to toil endlessly at something that has naturally run its course, just to satisfy a societal demand for permanence?
Relieving ourselves of that undue, artificial burden requires a massive paradigm shift. But doing so could radically alter how we experience the natural ebb and flow of human connection. It shifts the end of a relationship from a devastating moral failing to a natural, albeit painful, stage of emotional evolution.
I agree completely.
This brings us to a part of the deep dive where the sociological concepts get incredibly viscerally intimate. We've seen how society infiltrates our initial attractions, defines the parameters of our relationships, and demands our endless labor to maintain them.
Right.
But surely, you might think, there's one sanctuary left. When the bedroom door is locked, the lights are turned down low, and it's just you and your partner.
Surely that physical space is private.
You would hope so.
But the authors argue, absolutely not. The society you live in is right there in the bed with you. This is perhaps the most invasive, unsettling aspect of love politics explored in the chapter. To explain how this happens, the authors rely heavily on a brilliant sociological framework known as the intimate justice framework.
Intimate justice. How does that operate?
The intimate justice framework forces us to connect the macro to the micro. It focuses our attention on how massive, overarching social and political inequities, things like sexism, objectification, and patriarchal power structures, do not just exist in the workplace or the legislature.
They actively impact the microscopic, neurological, and physical details of our intimate lives.
Yes. This framework posits that societal inequality fundamentally alters how individuals imagine their own sexual selves, how they behave physically in the moment of intimacy, and ultimately how they are able to evaluate and experience their own physical pleasure.
And the clearest, most devastating avenue for this societal intrusion is the battleground of body image. The text cites research which documents how women experience a significantly higher volume of negative, intrusive thoughts about their physical bodies compared to men.
And the authors make a vital point here. These localized negative thoughts did not just organically sprout in women's heads out of nowhere.
No, they are meticulously and deliberately cultivated by the culture at large. The sheer volume of messaging directed at women regarding their physical forms is staggering.
From a very young age, through mass media, parental modeling, peer pressure, and a multi-billion-dollar beauty and diet industry, the relentless message is that a woman's natural, unaltered body is inherently inadequate.
The culture insists that the body must be constantly managed, shrunken, altered, or hidden in order to be deemed appealing or worthy of love. The social control of physical appearance is a deeply effective, highly political tool for maintaining insecurity and thus compliance.
And the tragic part is that this psychological conditioning literally sabotages the physical, neurological experience of sex.
How so?
The authors detail a fascinating, if incredibly depressing, study. The researchers wanted to look at the direct physiological connection between cognitive body self-esteem and actual physical sexual arousal in women.
Okay, so they brought women into a lab.
Yes, into a controlled laboratory setting. First, they assessed the participants' baseline body esteem, how positively or negatively they viewed their own physical form based on societal standards. Then, they had these women view erotic material.
Okay.
While the women watched, the researchers actively monitored their physiological responses, specifically measuring genital blood flow and signs of biological arousal.
And the mechanics of what they found are astonishing. The women who had absorbed society's negative messaging and suffered from poor body esteem actually exhibited a significantly lower physical response to the erotica.
Yes, the psychological burden of societal judgment actively interfered with their sympathetic nervous system. The cognitive load of worrying about their bodies essentially hijacked the neural pathways required for sensory input and physical arousal.
Wait, that is terrifying when you really think about the implications.
It really is.
It means that culture is literally overriding autonomous human biology. Society's unrealistic, politically motivated beauty standards don't just make people feel bad emotionally or cry in dressing rooms. Those standards are actively, chemically dictating how much physical enthusiasm and physiological desire a human being is capable of feeling during a sexual encounter.
It is a startling realization of how deep the tendrils of social control reach. And this cognitive interference extends far beyond baseline desire. It inserts itself right into the middle of the physical sex act itself.
The text introduces a concept developed through research to explain this phenomenon. They identified a psychological behavior they termed spectatoring.
Spectatoring.
Let me try to put an analogy to this to explain the mechanics. Imagine you are sitting down at an exclusive Michelin star restaurant to eat the most incredible, meticulously crafted meal of your life.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
But instead of tasting the complex flavors or enjoying the texture of the food, you can't taste a single thing. Why? Because your brain is completely anxiously consumed by obsessing over how your mouth looks from the outside while you are chewing.
Oh, wow.
You are paralyzed by worrying about what the people at the next table think of the angle of your jaw or the way you hold your fork. You are physically eating the meal, but mentally you are entirely disconnected from the sensory experience.
That is a perfect encapsulation of the cognitive mechanics of spectatoring, applied directly to physical intimacy. Spectatoring is the act of psychologically stepping outside of your own body during a sexual encounter and observing yourself from an imagined, highly critical, third-person perspective.
Like an out-of-body experience, but a really anxious one.
Yes. Instead of being present and feeling your own physical pleasure, your cognitive bandwidth is entirely consumed by evaluating how an outsider or your partner views you. You are mentally paralyzed, wondering if your stomach looks flat when you bend that way, or if your thighs are spreading in a manner that society has deemed unattractive.
You become an anxious audience member to your own intimacy.
Exactly. And researchers found exactly what you would mathematically expect. Spectatoring completely decimates the joy of the encounter. Because your brain can only process so much information at once, individuals who are mentally occupied with anxiously evaluating their bodies experience significantly less physical sexual pleasure.
And because of the relentless, highly targeted societal messaging we discussed earlier, these distracting, pleasure-killing thoughts strike women at a far more frequent rate than men.
The anonymous, judgmental figures inhabiting our minds, the internalized voices of societal beauty standards, are literally standing in the corner of the bedroom holding a clipboard, evaluating the performance.
Which naturally brings the authors to the incredibly complex tension between performing sex and genuinely feeling it. To navigate this, they dive into sociological analysis regarding performing sex.
This part of the text is so crucial because it dismantles a very modern illusion. The analysis points out how women, in particular, are caught in a terrible, confusing bind when it comes to the concept of modern sexual liberation.
Because mainstream society often pats itself on the back, pointing to pop culture and saying, look how sexually liberated and free women are today.
But the authors point out that this supposed liberation is actually heavily constrained and heavily curated. The only types of liberated sexual expressions that are culturally applauded or rewarded are the specific behaviors that happen to be highly appealing to a heterosexual male audience.
The hypocrisy is structural. Society tells a woman she is incredibly empowered, liberated, and owning her sexuality if she dresses in a stereotypically provocative way, or if she engages in performative bisexuality like kissing another woman at a party while men actively watch and applaud.
These acts are celebrated because they cater to the dominant male gaze. But at the exact same time, that same society maintains an intense, deeply ingrained disgust for the natural, uncurated realities of the female body stigmatizing menstruation, natural body hair, or bodies that do not fit a narrow, thin ideal.
The text uses a very potent cultural touchstone to illustrate this. The Girls Gone Wild video franchise from the early 2000s.
Well, that's a great example.
For a long time, there was this pervasive cultural narrative that the young women in those videos were the vanguard of modern sexual empowerment. The argument was that they were rejecting puritanical prudishness, throwing off the shackles of conservative values, and joyfully celebrating their bodily expression.
But the authors of this chapter argue forcefully that this was not true autonomous liberation. It was a carefully orchestrated, highly commodified performance designed entirely for male consumption and profit.
Right. And analyzing phenomena like that reveals a profound psychological confusion that trickles down to individuals in their own private bedrooms.
The boundary line between what a person genuinely, biologically enjoys for their own personal pleasure and what they have been deeply conditioned to perform in order to be validated as a desirable, liberated, fun partner becomes completely hopelessly blurred.
It creates a constant internal monologue during intimacy. Am I doing this specific act because it physically feels good to my nervous system? Or am I doing it because society handed me a subconscious script that says, this is what the cool, highly valued partner does in bed?
The authors argue that our physical choices, our boundaries, and our expressions in bed are being constantly micromanaged by society's pervasive representations of sexuality. We are rarely, if ever, acting as completely free, uninfluenced agents.
Which is exactly why the intimate justice approach is so vital. We have to be able to locate our highly personal sexual experiences and our sexual anxieties within these massive political structures.
It is the only way to truly understand why we feel the way we do, why we experience anxiety in moments of vulnerability, and why we make the intimate choices we make.
So we've clearly seen how societal power dynamics infiltrate our initial attractions, define the heavy burdens of our relationships, and even dictate our physiological responses in the bedroom.
We have.
But surely, if we want to untangle all of this and find the objective truth, we can just turn to the cold, hard, unbiased realm of scientific research, right? Scientists are neutral observers. They use the scientific method. They can give us the unvarnished mathematical truth about human love.
You would hope so. But the authors actually save their final and perhaps most damning critique for their very own academic field.
Plot twist.
They argue that the scientists who research love and human sexuality are, fundamentally, human beings first, which means they have grown up in the exact same society as the rest of us, and they carry their own societal baggage, their own internalized hierarchies, and their own political biases straight through the laboratory doors.
And the authors of this chapter actually experienced this bias firsthand. As we mentioned, they study consensual non-monogamy, and they noted a bizarre pattern.
What happened?
Whenever they submitted research papers for publication that contained empirical data showing CNM couples were just as happy, healthy, and functional as monogamous couples, they faced intense, highly unusual pushback during the peer review process.
From other scientists?
Yes. Other scientists, their supposed objective peers, would reject the papers or leave scathing comments, essentially accusing the team of being biased or flawed, simply because the mathematical results did not validate the supremacy of monogamy.
And they were not isolated in this experience. The text cites the work of another researcher who studied the developmental outcomes of children raised in polyamorous family structures.
Oh, that sounds like a lightning rod for criticism.
It was. When she attempted to publish data showing that these children were well-adjusted and healthy, the peer review feedback she received was uniquely defensive, hostile, and vitriolic.
It wasn't just normal scientific critique.
No, it did not read like standard dispassionate scientific critique regarding sample sizes or p-values. It felt like an institutionalized, deeply personal, sex-negative backlash from a scientific community intent on protecting the status quo.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The authors of our text decided they were going to actually test this scientific hypocrisy. They designed an incredibly clever, somewhat devious experiment to catch the bias in action.
I love this experiment.
They wrote up a highly detailed description of a completely fictional research study about relationship outcomes. But they created two distinct versions of the abstract for this fake study.
Version A and version B.
Right. In version A, the fictional data concluded that monogamous relationships produce higher quality outcomes for the partners. In version B, the fictional data concluded that polyamorous relationships produced higher quality outcomes.
And the methodology of how they presented this is the critical key to the experiment. The exact same academic vocabulary, the exact same statistical methodology, the exact same sample sizes, and the exact same data structures were used in both versions.
It was a perfect mirror image.
Yes. The only variable that was altered was the final conclusion, whether the designated winner of the study was monogamy or polyamory.
They then presented these abstracts to a pool of participants who were familiar with evaluating research and asked them to rate the competence, the methodology, and the overall scientific rigor of the fictional researchers who supposedly conducted the study.
And the results are just a devastating indictment of human bias.
They really are. The participants who read the abstract where polyamory had the better outcomes consistently rated those researchers as highly biased, methodologically flawed, and generally worse scientists than the researchers who miraculously found monogamy to be mathematically superior.
Even though, as you noted, the underlying scientific data presented to them was absolutely identical.
It's unbelievable.
The mechanism at play here is profound cognitive dissonance. It proves that when empirical research contradicts the dominant societal paradigm, in this specific case, the unquestioned supreme virtue of lifelong monogamy people, including highly trained academics and scientists, will automatically deploy defensive cognitive mechanisms.
They will view the research as inherently flawed or politically motivated because it threatens their worldview.
Think about it. If an individual has sacrificed immense personal desires, stayed in an unhappy marriage, and labored under the Protestant work ethic of romance for decades simply because society told them monogamy was the only morally correct path, it is deeply, viscerally jarring for them to read a peer-reviewed study that essentially says, hey, the data shows you could have been perfectly happy living a different way.
The accusation of bad science is merely a psychological defense mechanism to protect their own life choices.
Exactly.
And the text points out that this kind of institutional bias isn't a new phenomenon. It has a dark historical precedent. The authors draw a brilliant, necessary parallel to the groundbreaking work of a psychologist named Evelyn Hooker in the 1950s.
To understand the gravity of Hooker's work, you have to understand the context of the 1950s. At that time, the entire supposedly objective medical and psychiatric community uniformly classified gay men as fundamentally mentally ill.
Homosexuality was officially listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance. That was the unassailable scientific consensus of the era.
It was treated as objective biological fact. But Evelyn Hooker suspected that this fact was merely societal prejudice masquerading as science. So she designed a rigorously controlled study.
She administered a complex battery of standard psychological tests, like the Rorschach ink blot test, to two distinct groups of men. One group of entirely heterosexual men and one group of homosexual men who were not incarcerated or in psychiatric care.
And here is the genius part of her methodology. She took all the test results, stripped them of any identifying information regarding the men's sexuality, and handed them to a panel of expert, established clinicians.
A completely blind test.
Yes, she asked these experts to review the psychological profiles blindly and sort them into two piles: mentally healthy and mentally ill.
And the clinicians utterly failed. They could not statistically distinguish between the psychological profiles of the gay men and the heterosexual men.
Hooker's empirical data definitively proved that gay men were not inherently maladjusted, psychotic, or mentally ill. Her work completely, unequivocally contradicted the objective scientific consensus of the time.
She took immense pains to ensure her methodology was flawless, but her outcomes were inherently explosively political because they directly challenged the established power structure that relied on marginalizing gay people.
And this historical reality leads the authors to discuss a crucial philosophical framework called standpoint theory.
Standpoint theory, what does that propose?
It proposes a radical idea regarding how we acquire knowledge. It essentially argues that human scientists can never ever be entirely perfectly objective. Why? Because every single scientist views the world and their data from a distinct, inescapable social and political context.
A researcher who comes from a historically marginalized background is going to naturally perceive the subtle power dynamics of a classroom, the hidden frictions in a romantic relationship, or the biases in a laboratory very differently than a researcher who has lived their entire life occupying a position of societal dominance.
The researcher in power literally lacks the lived experience required to see the invisible structures that benefit them. And other philosophers built upon this work by introducing the concept of strong objectivity.
Strong objectivity.
Yes, the idea is that because perfect, godlike neutrality is an absolute myth, we shouldn't pretend it exists. Instead, the only way for the scientific community to get closer to the actual robust truth is to intentionally and systematically include multiple diverse perspectives in the research process.
They argue that we must actively seek out and include the viewpoints of people in lower positions of societal power. Why? Because individuals on the margins of society are forced to understand both their own world and the world of the dominant culture just to survive.
Therefore, they possess a unique vantage point that allows them to clearly see the flaws, the biases, and the false assumptions in the dominant narrative flaws that the people holding the power are entirely blind to.
I want you, the listener, to actively remember standpoint theory the very next time you are scrolling through your phone and you see an article in a mainstream magazine that boldly claims new science proves the secret to a happy marriage is X.
Right, take it with a grain of salt.
You need to realize that that specific scientific fact has been run through a gauntlet of human filters before it reached your eyes. It was initially designed by a researcher operating within their own specific cultural worldview. It was then peer-reviewed by an academic board that may be actively protecting a dominant societal paradigm. And finally, it was translated and written up by a journalist carrying their own set of internalized biases.
Science is an incredibly powerful, self-correcting process, but it is not magically immune to the invisible politics of love.
Which is exactly why the authors advocate so fiercely for people who love differently, whether that means queer individuals, polyamorous people, people of color, or anyone from a historically marginalized background, to be actively, institutionally supported in researching the psychology of love.
Diversifying the observers is the only known antidote to the bias of the institution.
Wow. We have covered an absolute mountain of sociological and psychological ground today, unraveling the invisible threads that control our private lives. Let's synthesize this journey to see the full picture.
Let's do a quick recap.
We started by looking at the seemingly magical initial spark of human attraction, only to realize that our deeply personal types are heavily scalded by systemic societal hierarchies of race, body standards, and power.
From there, we explored the cultural trap of the soulmate, unpacking how this strict political mandate of monogamy forces us to place an impossible, crushing burden of expectations onto a single human partner, setting us up for inevitable disappointment.
We then examined the brutal Protestant work ethic of romance, revealing how society cruelly blames individuals for their relationship failures while conveniently turning a blind eye to the massive systemic external stressors like financial terror and racial discrimination that actually tear couples apart.
We followed those societal pressures directly into the bedroom, utilizing the intimate justice framework to understand how relentless cultural messaging regarding body image actively suppresses physiological pleasure.
Inducing that anxious state of spectatoring that turns physical intimacy into a curated performance rather than a genuine experience.
And finally, we pulled back the curtain on the academic world, seeing how even the supposedly pristine, objective science of love is heavily colored by the desperate desire of researchers to protect the dominant cultural paradigms they have built their own lives upon.
The overarching, inescapable lesson of this text is that human love is deeply, permanently steeped in societal power dynamics. You are never, ever loving in a vacuum. But that raises the ultimate question: what do we actually do with this heavy information?
Right, the actionable part.
The authors don't just want to deconstruct your worldview. They offer some highly actionable advice for you to take back into your own life. First and foremost, they ask us to actively, courageously examine our own behaviors and the hidden power dynamics operating within our own relationships.
This requires a new level of emotional intelligence. For example, the authors suggest that if you belong to a demographic group that has historically held more power or privilege in society, and your partner belongs to a historically marginalized group, Your partner may occasionally exhibit wariness, caution, or defensiveness in certain situations.
The author's advice is critical here. Do not immediately take this personally or become offended.
Instead of instantly attributing their hesitation to them being a flawed, overly sensitive, or difficult individual, take a step back and acknowledge the historical and political position of their social group.
Understand that their guard being up is likely a deeply rational, learned survival response to navigating complicated, often hostile social structures. If you can understand that, you can work together to counter those external forces rather than fighting each other.
It's entirely about using this sociological knowledge to foster profound, radical empathy.
In a world right now that feels increasingly fractured, partisan, hateful, and relentlessly uncivil, perhaps the most radical, healing thing we can do as individuals is strive to deeply structurally understand the sociopolitical forces that are acting upon the people we claim to love.
We have to learn the difficult skill of untangling the individual person from the invisible politics that surround them.
It requires immense patience and, perhaps more importantly, a genuine willingness to completely unlearn a vast amount of what we have been aggressively taught to accept as natural or biological our entire lives.
Unlearning is the hardest part.
Which brings me all the way back to the image we started with. We talked about that beautiful, intoxicating illusion at the beginning of a crush. That feeling of tumbling into a new relationship and desperately wanting to believe that it is just you and them, floating in a private, isolated universe of your own making.
We've spent this entire deep dive looking at the data, proving that society is, in fact, right there in the room with you, quietly pulling the strings of your desires and expectations.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over long after you finish listening today.
It is a cushion that requires you to actively use the critical lens we've built today.
Exactly. If we bravely accept the reality that society has acted as an invisible, overbearing third partner in every single romantic relationship we have ever had, dictating our attractions, managing our boundaries, and evaluating our worth, what would it look like? And what would it actually feel like in your own life to finally turn around, look that invisible third partner in the eye, and ask society to leave the room?
What authentic version of yourself is left standing when the audience is finally gone?
I'll let you think on that.